For decades, Vince Gill built a reputation that almost seemed untouchable. One of the most respected voices in country music. A man known as much for his kindness as his talent. But behind that steady image, the past few years have brought a series of events that quietly changed everything. It didn't start with a scandal or a career collapse, but with something far more personal and far more difficult to control. As his wife Amy Grant faced one life-threatening health crisis after another, Vince Gill found himself in a position he had never been in before. And the truth is, the weight of those years may be catching up with him in ways fans are only beginning to understand. For most of his career, Vince Gill's story followed a path that felt almost unusually stable for the music industry. He wasn't the kind of artist known for public meltdowns, legal battles, or dramatic controversies. Instead, he built his legacy slowly, step by step, through consistency, musicianship, and a reputation that earned him the nickname the nicest guy in Nashville, a title he reportedly first received from session musicians in the 1980s who noted he was one of the only A-list players who still showed up early to rehearsals and learned everyone's part, not just his own. But what makes his current situation more concerning is precisely that contrast. Because when someone like Vince Gill starts to show signs of strain, it doesn't look dramatic on the surface. It looks quiet, controlled, and easy to overlook. To understand why things feel different now, you have to go back to how carefully he built his career. Born in Norman, Oklahoma in 1957, Gill grew up in a household where his father, a federal judge, played banjo and guitar as a hobby, exposing him early to bluegrass and country standards. After joining Pure Prairie League, he quickly proved he wasn't just another replacement singer. His voice carried a softness that stood out, but more importantly, it translated into results. Let Me Love You Tonight didn't just become a hit, climbing into the top 10 of the pop charts in 1980, an unusual crossover for a band rooted in country rock. It established him as someone capable of leading a band through a transition period. But even then, success didn't come easily. The band's identity was already shifting, and despite his contributions, he was still navigating uncertainty about his place in the industry. That uncertainty followed him into the next phase of his career. Leaving the band to join Rodney Crowell's Circle wasn't a guaranteed upgrade. In fact, it was a risk taken at a time when his momentum had slowed. The Cherry Bombs didn't offer instant fame, but they gave him something more valuable: proximity to Nashville's inner circle. It was there that he began building relationships that would later define his career, including the connection with Tony Brown, who would eventually play a critical role in reshaping his sound and direction. Several musicians who passed through that scene, including Emory Gordy Jr. and Hank DeVito, later credited those years as some of the most musically generous of their careers, recalling Gill as someone who would hand off solos rather than hoard the spotlight. Even his early solo work reflects a pattern that would repeat throughout his life: slow progress, mixed results, and quiet persistence. His first releases didn't dominate the charts, but they earned respect within the industry. He spent time performing at small venues like the Bluebird Cafe, refining his songwriting rather than chasing immediate hits. That period mattered more than it seemed at the time because it forced him to confront his own limitations, especially his lack of confidence in his voice, something even his producers tried to compensate for by pushing instruments forward in the mix. What changed everything was not a sudden breakthrough, but a shift in how his music was presented. When Tony Brown began producing his work, he made a deliberate decision to bring Vince Gill's voice to the forefront. That choice didn't just alter the sound, it redefined how audiences experienced him. The result was When I Call Your Name, released in 1989, a song that didn't rely on spectacle, but on emotional clarity. It earned him major awards and recognition, including his first Grammy, and is frequently cited by music historians as the record that effectively reset the commercial template for country ballads heading into the 1990s. But more importantly, it confirmed that his strength had always been there. It just hadn't been fully heard yet. By the time Vince Gill reached the peak of his success, the part of his life that seemed the most stable on the outside was already beginning to fracture behind the scenes. His marriage to Janice Oliver, a member of the duo Sweethearts of the Rodeo, had lasted for years, and from a distance, it looked like a partnership built on shared music and shared ambition. They were both part of the same creative world. Both understood the demands of touring and recording, and for a long time, that common ground held things together. But what wasn't visible to the public was how the pressures of success were quietly pulling them in different directions. As his career grew in the early years of his breakthrough, Vince was no longer just a working musician trying to find his place. He had become a central figure in country music with awards, chart success, and a demanding touring schedule that kept him away from home for long stretches. The same dedication that helped him build his career also created distance in his personal life. It wasn't one dramatic moment that caused a breakdown, but a slow accumulation of missed time, emotional fatigue, and the kind of disconnect that builds when two people are moving at different speeds. The divorce, finalized in 1997, didn't arrive with a public explosion, but its impact was significant. When it was finalized, custody of their daughter Jenny went to Janice, and Vince had to adjust to a reality that many people in his position rarely talk about openly. He was no longer part of a daily family structure, and that absence carried a weight that couldn't be measured in headlines or awards. Around this time, many observers began to notice a shift in his music. The songs became more reflective, more restrained, and in some cases more emotionally direct than anything he had released before. That shift became especially clear in the material that followed, including tracks that fellow songwriters later described as some of the most quietly devastating ballads to come out of Nashville that decade. Tracks from this period weren't just written from observation. They felt lived in. Critics pointed out that his songwriting carried a different kind of honesty, one that suggested personal experience rather than crafted storytelling. Even without explicitly naming the events behind them, the emotional tone had changed. There was a sense of loss, but also a sense of acceptance, as if he was trying to process something that couldn't be easily resolved. Then came another turning point that complicated everything even further. Vince Gill's relationship with Amy Grant didn't begin under simple circumstances. At the time, both of them were coming out of their own marriages, hers to musician Gary Chapman, and their connection drew attention for reasons that went beyond music. For some fans, it was difficult to separate the timing of their relationship from the end of his previous one. That tension followed them in the early stages, adding a layer of public scrutiny to what was already a deeply personal transition, particularly because Grant's career had been built partly within the contemporary Christian music industry, a space where personal scandal carried a different kind of weight than it did in mainstream country. But what made this relationship different wasn't how it started, but how it evolved. Amy Grant wasn't just another partner entering his life during a period of change. She represented a shift in how he approached both his career and his identity. The two shared a quieter, more grounded perspective, one that contrasted sharply with the pace and pressure of the industry he had been navigating for years. Their marriage, which took place in 2000, brought a sense of stability, but also required Vince to confront parts of himself that had been easy to ignore when his focus was entirely on work. For years after their marriage, Vince Gill and Amy Grant appear to have found something rare in the entertainment world. A relationship that didn't just survive change, but seemed to grow stronger because of it. They built a life that was far less chaotic than what either of them had experienced before, grounded in family, music, and a shared understanding of what really mattered, including raising their daughter Karina together alongside children from both of their previous marriages. But everything began to shift in a way neither of them saw coming. And it started with something so ordinary it almost seemed insignificant at first. In 2020, Vince Gill was the one who went in for a routine medical check after experiencing shortness of breath while climbing stairs. It wasn't a dramatic emergency, just the kind of concern that many people would brush off. When the results came back, the doctor told him his heart was in excellent condition and even joked that his only issue was being out of shape. It could have ended there. But instead, the doctor turned to Amy Grant and suggested she undergo testing as well, pointing out her family history of heart problems. She resisted at first because she felt completely fine, but eventually agreed. What followed changed everything. The tests revealed that Amy Grant had PAPVR, a rare congenital heart defect that disrupts the way blood flows through the heart, a condition that medical researchers note often goes undetected for decades because patients can appear outwardly healthy and asymptomatic well into adulthood. It wasn't just a minor issue that could be monitored over time. According to the doctor, if it wasn't treated, it would become catastrophic at some point. There was no real option but surgery. And not just any surgery, open-heart surgery, the kind of procedure that immediately shifts your entire sense of normal. The timing made it even harder. This was happening during a period when hospital access was heavily restricted because of pandemic protocols, and Vince Gill was not allowed to be present during the operation. For someone who had built his entire life around being present on stage, in the studio, with his family, that absence was something he couldn't control. He had to leave the hospital and wait, knowing that one of the most critical moments of his wife's life was happening without him there. That loss of control is something he later described as one of the hardest parts of the experience. When he was finally allowed to see her after the surgery, she was still under anesthesia. He described the moment not in dramatic terms, but in a way that revealed just how much pressure had been building beneath the surface. Seeing her lying there peaceful, he immediately understood that she had made it through. It wasn't relief in a loud or overwhelming sense. It was quiet, but it was definitive. In that moment, everything else, career, schedules, obligations, stopped mattering. Because the world had slowed down at the time, Vince Gill was able to step fully into a role that had nothing to do with music. He became her primary support during recovery, managing the day-to-day reality of healing that most fans never see, including coordinating physical therapy schedules and learning to manage post-surgical medications himself rather than relying on outside caregivers. And what stood out to him wasn't just the physical recovery, but the way Amy handled it. She approached it with a kind of steady resilience, treating each stage not as a crisis, but as something to move through one step at a time. If the heart surgery had been the end of it, Vince Gill might have been able to return to some version of normal life. But what made the situation far more difficult was what came next. Because just as Amy Grant began to recover, another crisis arrived without warning. This time it wasn't something discovered in a hospital. It happened in a single moment out on the road during what should have been an ordinary bike ride near their Tennessee home in 2022. Amy hit a pothole and crashed hard enough to lose consciousness, even while wearing a helmet. The injuries weren't limited to cuts or bruises. She suffered a traumatic brain injury that required immediate hospitalization and long-term recovery, the kind that specialists in the field often describe as having an unpredictable timeline measured in years rather than weeks. For Vince Gill, the shift was immediate. He canceled scheduled performances without hesitation and went straight to her side, prioritizing her condition over everything else. But unlike the previous surgery, this wasn't a recovery with a clear timeline. The effects were unpredictable. Amy later admitted that the process was emotionally exhausting, not just physically demanding. Entire parts of her life slowed down. Tours were canceled, plans disappeared, and she was forced into a position where she had to question whether she would ever fully return to the person she had been before. For someone whose identity had been tied to performance for decades, that uncertainty carried a weight that was difficult to explain. What made this period even more revealing was how Vince Gill handled it. He didn't try to control the situation or push for quick recovery. Instead, he focused on stability, reminding her to take each day as it came. At one point, during her lowest moments, he told her something simple but direct, that life continues to bring challenges, and the only way through is one step at a time. It wasn't dramatic, but it was exactly what she needed. Even as he continued performing when possible, the balance had shifted completely. His career was no longer the center of his life. Everything now revolved around whether Amy was getting better. And just as they were trying to adjust to that reality, another challenge appeared, proving that this difficult chapter was far from over. What makes the situation surrounding Vince Gill feel heavier now isn't just one crisis, but the accumulation of everything that followed. After the brain injury, Amy Grant was still dealing with lingering effects that didn't simply disappear with time. Memory lapses became part of daily life, sometimes subtle, sometimes noticeable enough to interrupt ordinary conversations. During one interview, when she was asked to recall details from the early years of their marriage, she openly admitted that those memories felt unclear. It wasn't a dramatic confession, but it revealed something deeper. Some parts of their shared history were no longer fully accessible to her. In those moments, Vince Gill quietly stepped in, filling in the gaps without making it feel like a loss. He would answer questions for her, clarify timelines, and keep conversations moving without drawing attention to what had changed. It became a kind of unspoken partnership where both of them adapted in real time. He even described it in a lighthearted way, calling it a tag team. But underneath that humor was a reality that required constant adjustment. This wasn't a temporary phase. It was something they had to live with. At the same time, Amy faced another challenge that directly affected the core of who she is as an artist. A cyst in her throat required surgery, and the recovery process meant she had to relearn how to sing, working with vocal therapists to slowly rebuild range and control that had taken decades to develop in the first place. For someone whose entire career was built on her voice, that kind of setback is more than physical. It forces a complete reevaluation of identity, confidence, and purpose. And once again, Vince Gill was there, not as a performer or collaborator, but as the steady presence she relied on to get through it. There was also shoulder surgery, another layer in what had already become a long list of medical issues. Individually, each event could have been managed. Together, they created a prolonged period where uncertainty became the norm. And for Vince Gill, that meant living in a constant state of vigilance, always prepared for the next setback, always adjusting his life around someone else's recovery. What makes this particularly difficult to recognize from the outside is that Vince Gill hasn't changed his public demeanor. He still appears calm, still performs, still carries himself the way people expect, including continuing his decades-long association with the Eagles as a touring member and maintaining his annual charity golf tournament that has raised millions for junior golf programs in Tennessee. But the reality behind that image is very different. The past few years have required him to take on a role that doesn't come with applause or recognition. It's the kind of responsibility that slowly reshapes a person, not through a single moment, but through repetition, patience, and endurance. And that's where the real concern begins to surface. Not because Vince Gill has failed in any visible way, but because he hasn't. He has carried everything quietly without letting it spill into public view. But even the strongest people are affected by what they carry over time. When you look at everything he has been through, balancing a demanding career while supporting his wife through multiple serious health crises, the question isn't whether he can handle it. The question is how long someone can keep doing it without something eventually giving way. After everything Vince Gill has faced in recent years, do you think he's still as strong as he appears? Or has this all taken a deeper toll than people realize? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you want more real stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe.